Hello, my name is Tom Repass of Canyon Rim Honeybees in the beautiful Black Hills of western South Dakota. This presentation is part of our series Introduction to Beekeeping, and it is about hive inspections, how to use a smoker, safety when working with honeybees, and how to minimize getting stung. Hive inspections. This is one of the things that new beekeepers are often intimidated by. Because let's be honest, you open up a hive full of flying, stinging insects, any of which could potentially sting you, and it's perfectly natural to be a little bit intimidated. With time and experience, you become much more comfortable working with your bees, and you realize that they're not going to fly up and get you, at least on good days anyway, when they're in a good mood. And you also learn about how to inspect your hive in a way that's going to be helpful, minimize stress to the bees, and also get the information that you need. So when are times that you might need to open up and inspect your hive? You might need to check to see if the queen bee is laying eggs and the bees are rearing brood. In the springtime, during swarm season, you might need to check to see if the bees are thinking about swarming or actually planning on swarming. They've actually built swarm cells, and now you have to take precautions to prevent them from swarming. To check if they need more room or space to store honey or for the queen to lay eggs and produce more brood. To look if the bees have stored enough honey for you to remove some of the boxes to take back and extract. To look for mites and diseases. To refill feeders. Now, one of the things that new beekeepers do, including what I did when I first started out 40 years ago, is sometimes you get into your hives, more often than you need to, because you're just so excited to have bees and you just want to look at them. But realize, you can tell a lot simply by watching them from the entrance. And, every time you do an inspection, just be aware that it does disturb the bees and it does interrupt their work temporarily. So you just don't want to check your hives too often out of curiosity, but only when there's a reason. The thing about beekeeping, and there are times when you have to do something and it has to be done in a timely manner. For example, add honey supers when the honey flow starts to keep the bees from becoming honeybound, or to take action to prevent swarming. But then there's other times when the bees do better when you ignore them and you don't check them very often. Try not to open up and check your hives more often than every 7 to 10 days unless there is an absolute reason that you have to go back sooner, for example, to release a queen from a cage or some other intervention. Ideally, you should not check hives when the bees are not flying, so that would be include on very cold days. Sometimes I have to peek in to refill a feeder or something like that. If I do have to check during a cold day or at night or during the rain, I will do it very quickly and without as little a disturbance as possible. But if you open a hive during a rain or at night, they might be very grouchy. They might ignore you on a warm, sunny day, but if you open them during times when there's not much to do and they're clustered in the hive, that might really get their attention, and you might find out your very calm, gentle bees are not that gentle on any of these times when it's not the best time to check bees. So a perfect day to perform a hive inspection is one that is sunny, warm, the bees are flying, and not much wind. Some of us more experienced beekeepers during the honey flow will actually check our hives with a minimal protection, maybe only a veil. Obviously, starting out, most of us are a little bit more intimidated, so I strongly recommend for beginning beekeepers to put on their gloves and their jacket or their bee suit, and that way you can be more comfortable and not have to worry about getting stung. Later on, when you get more experience, then you might want to do away with some of these things, such as your gloves, for example. So before you inspect your hives, gather up all the necessary tools and equipment. The 3 tools that are absolutely necessary are a veil to protect your face and eyes, a hive tool, and a smoker. All of these other things are nice to have, but not absolutely essential, although for a new beekeeper I would consider gloves and a jacket to be essential until you get more comfortable and get to understand whether your bees are defensive or not. You can observe much by observing the hive itself and the hive entrance before you open a hive. Are there foragers coming and going? Are they carrying pollen back to the hive? Are the bees fanning at the entrance? Can you smell ripening honey? one of the most wonderful things too is to do is during a honey float is to walk through your bee yard in the evening after all the bees are home and smell all that wonderful nectar as it's being evaporated and converted into honey. Are young bees flying on orientation flights? Do you see drones flying? Or maybe during a dearth or in the fall, are the drones being expelled by the workers? Is dead brood being removed? That might be a sign that the bees are starving or there's a dearth. And also look for robbing when other bees from other hives are trying to fly in. And this can be difficult for a new beekeeper to determine versus new bees going on orientation flights. But over time, you will get a good understanding and feel for what your bees are doing. Once your smoker is lit, you have your tools, put on your protective gear, you're now ready to inspect your hive. So when you're inspecting a hive, always stand to the side and work from the back or from the side. It's important because if you stand right in the front, the returning foragers, they're not going to remember this giant body that was standing there, and they may just fly into you, and you might even get stung, not because they're angry or defensive, but simply because you were there and they bounced into you. And plus, if there's any guard bees at the entrance that get a little bit irritated, they're going to look out to see what's going on, and they're going to see you, and you can bet they will fly to you. So stand to the side and back, puff smoke towards and into the entrance, and then as you pull the boxes apart, use the Hive Tool to remove frames slowly. Usually what most of us do is we pull the top cover and inner cover off, pry the boxes apart, and stack them on an overturned cover or on a hive stand so you don't squash any bees that might be clustering on the bottom. And we go all the way down to the bottom box, and then as we finish up, then we might put the other boxes on, go through them, and so on. As you work the hives, you smoke the top bars of the frames so that any bees that may be irritated and become defensive are distracted from that, and also to move bees out of the way so you don't squash any bees as you begin pulling frames out. There's nothing that will upset a colony of bees more than squashing excessive numbers of bees. If the bees seem to be cleaning out of the hive, before you put another box back on, use smoke to push them back down between the frames so you don't squish any more bees than you have to. Using your Hive Tool, remove the frames carefully. Ideally, it's best to start from one of the outer frames because the queen tends to not be on one of those frames, and it's less likely for you to accidentally injure or kill her. And once at least one or two frames is out of the hive, then it's much more easier to pry apart the others and pull them out. Try to keep the frames vertical to avoid injuring the bees or the queen, and try to pull them straight out as you pull them out. Also try to hold the frames over the colony, because if the queen accidentally falls off, she'll fall back into the colony rather than on the grass and be lost, especially if that happens without you seeing her or noticing. You might come back in another week or two and discover that the queen has disappeared or even been lost, and now there's a bunch of emergency cells being raised. So what should you look for when you're inspecting a hive? First, try to be careful and not damage the bees or squash any bees, as I already mentioned, because it really can make them mad. I've worked hives with new beekeepers, and they were wearing complete protection, a complete bee suit, and I was out there in t-shirt and shorts, and the new beekeeper just put the box right back on a hive like this, and obviously squashed a few hundred bees. And I was like, hold on a second, you're going to make these bees really mad, and it might not bother you because you have your bee suit and gloves on, but they're certainly going to come after me. And so this is something that you learn over time. And I've had, again, new beekeepers say, wow, you squish a lot fewer bees than I do. And again, that's because sometimes I'm out there wearing only a veil and no gloves and maybe in a short sleeve shirt, and I've learned that if I'm not careful, those bees will get upset, and they will let me know in the only way that they can. So whenever you open a hive, you generally look for the following. You want to make sure they have enough food stores, pollen, honey, so that they're not starving, that they have a good population of bees. If the population seems to have decreased, that can be a sign of a problem. Perhaps the hive is swarmed, or they're beginning to die off because of mites. Make sure there's different brood of all stages. Obviously, it depends on the time of the year. Maybe in the winter there's not going to be much or any brood. It's good to see eggs, and the main reason is if there's eggs, you know there's a queen present, and she's laying eggs, at least within the last 3 days anyway, because it takes 3 days for eggs to hatch. And then look for evidence of disease or pests, which I discuss in much more detail in a different presentation, honeybee diseases and parasites. So one of the things that is really important for a new beekeeper to learn is how to read the comb. Once you get more experience, you can understand what all of these things are. And this is a photo of a brood comb with the brood, the capped brood, in the center, and then in the corners you can see a little bit of capped honey. Here's another photo looking at all these different things. In the corner you can see the capped honey. At the very top there is open nectar, which is going to be honey, but it hasn't been ripened yet. You can see some cells usually next to or adjacent to the brood where there has been pollen placed, and that's food readily available for the nurse bees to feed the young baby bees, the brood. And then in the center of this frame you can see capped brood. So these are pupa that are going to emerge at some point. Here's a frame of new foundation that's been drawn out, a honeycomb. And so there's capped honey on top that has been ripened, and then at the bottom there's open liquid honey and nectar that's still not completely ripened. Here's a close-up of what pollen looks like, or after the pollen has been stored for some time, it is made into bee bread. A little bit of honey and enzymes are added, and there's a lactobacillus fermentation going on. And this can be stored over the long term for times when no flowers are blooming, and the bees need protein to raise more baby bees. This is a picture of both capped and open brood. So in the center, that's the capped brood that is pupated, and on the outside are larvae that are open and have not yet been capped. And you can see a couple little spots there where the beekeeper accidentally damaged a few of the brood. Maybe there was some burr comb, or they didn't lift it out straight. The bees will repair this. Any of the larvae that was injured or killed will be removed, and the bees will repair this usually within a few hours. Here's a close-up, at the right, that's eggs, a little bit out of focus, and then some younger larvae. And then on the lower left, there's some more mature larvae that's ready to be capped. Here's a photo of healthy capped worker brood with a few spots that maybe the queen did not lay eggs in, or maybe something happened to the larva. Again, another brood frame with a little bit of honey at the top left, mostly capped worker brood, but at the bottom corner you see these bulging bullet-shaped cells, and that's a drone brood. So drones are slightly larger than worker bees, and so the bees need to produce different size cells for the drone eggs and then larvae and pupa need to develop in. This is a frame that has a lot of things going on. So it's mostly drone brood, the bullet-shaped cells that you see. There's a little tiny spot of capped worker brood here, and then down here is a single queen cell that's being developed that has not yet been capped yet. So there's all three types of brood that you could possibly see in a hive are represented in this photo. Well, let's talk about queen cells. There's different kinds of queen cells, and a lot of the bee books and the beekeepers say, oh, well, what kind of queen cell is it? Because there's different reasons for bees to raise a new queen. Perhaps she accidentally got injured or killed, and they need to raise new ones. That would be an emergency queen cell. Perhaps the bees are thinking of swarming, and those would be queen cells. Or perhaps the queen is still present, but she's getting old, and they want to replace her with a new, younger daughter queen. So a lot of the bee books go through, and they say, how do you recognize what type of queen cell it is? Of course, in real life, the bees don't read the books that humans write, so things are not always quite as clear-cut. The photos I put in this presentation are obvious, just to make it easier for you. But as you go along keeping bees, you're going to learn that things are not always quite as clear-cut in real life. And sometimes you'll look at a queen cell and you'll be like, I don't know, is that a swarm cell? Or are they trying to supersede? What are they doing? So when you see a lot of small queen cells on the face of the comb, so basically the bees decided to raise queens out of eggs that were laid in the worker brood, most commonly that's going to be emergency queen cells. So basically what happened is the queen died, or maybe she fell out of the hive when you weren't looking, or you squashed her, or something happened, and the bees realize that they're queenless, and so they go and find eggs that are just about ready to hatch, or are hatching, and they build queen cells. They pull them out of the face of the worker comb. So typically, emergency queen cells are multiple in number. They're often on the face of the comb. They usually are smaller than supersedure or swarm cells, and you'll also not see any eggs present because the queen is gone. She disappeared or she died. And so that's really important. You don't want to go and cut out all these cells because, this hive may be queenless, and if you cut out all those cells, now that this hive is doomed unless you realize that and you get them a new queen, or you give them some brood from another hive that has eggs and young larvae that they can raise queens from. So this type of cell, we tend to see them more commonly later in the summer, and usually they're large and they're single, maybe one or two present, and these are supersedure cells. So when a queen is getting older and failing, and it's not a really good time of year for the bees to swarm, what they'll often do is decide to raise a new daughter queen, and once that daughter queen is ready and mated, then the old queen usually will disappear. Maybe the bees stop feeding her or whatever. And usually supersedure cells are fewer in number than emergency or swarm cells. They're most commonly on the face of the comb, but not always. They're larger than emergency queen cells, and there are eggs still present because the old queen is still present. It's just the bees realize that it's time to raise a new queen to replace her. And then finally, there's this type of cell. These are cells that are numerous in number, most commonly seen on the bottom bars, but they can be seen on the face of the comb. They tend to be large, and they tend to occur during the times of the year when the bees might want to swarm, and these are swarm cells. They tend to be numerous. They tend to be larger, well-fed with royal jelly as compared to emergency queen cells. As I mentioned, they're often on the bottom of the comb, but not always. The bees don't read the bee books. They do what they want, when they want, and how they want. And there may be eggs present from the old queen, but maybe not. Sometimes, or especially if the colony is already swarmed, or sometimes or much of the time, the bees will sort of push the queen around and stop feeding her as much so she can kind of slim down and be able to fly. So there might not be eggs a few days before the swarm flies out of the hive. And I have a whole entire presentation about swarm management and swarm prevention. And this is really more a technique that you're going to need to know as an intermediate beekeeper, from your second year onwards. Although I guess if you had some nukes that you didn't put into a new hive fast enough, they might want to swarm on you. Sometimes you'll see queen cells like this. So the one on the left, there's a little hole on the tip. That's an emerged queen cell. So that queen developed and the virgin queen left that queen cell. So she could be wandering around your hive, or she could be out on a mating flight, or maybe there's more than one virgin queen and they're about ready to fight it out to the death. And this is the little tip on the side. Sometimes you can actually see even the capping still attached, like a little trap door that was pushed aside. It's pretty neat when you see this. It's even more cool when you see the queen herself emerging. And they usually do it fairly quickly, usually within 10-15 minutes. Now, the queen cells on the right with a hole on the side, those are a destroyed queen cell. And you see the hole on the side rather than the tip. So that queen didn't develop. So what happened was either another virgin queen came in, opened it up, and stung her sister so that she could kill her without having to fight it out to the death. She had the advantage, of course, by opening up the side of the cell with her sister that has not emerged. Or sometimes the workers themselves will decide that they don't want a queen. Maybe they swarm, they don't need any more queens. They already have a queen that has been mated, and so the workers sometimes will destroy these on their own as well. Well, what about these? We see these commonly on the bottom bars, and these are not queen cells yet, at least not until there is an egg and a larva within them. But this is where the queen will often lay an egg. Once the colony is thinking about swarming, the queen bee will come down and lay eggs, and so these are what we call queen cell cups. So they're not a queen cell until there's an egg or larva present. You commonly find them in the spring during the swarm season, but it doesn't mean the hive is going to definitely swarm, but you should definitely keep an eye on them. Well, here's a comb of worker brood, and it's good to get an eye for what's an excellent brood pattern versus a poor brood pattern. So this is an excellent brood pattern. Boy, I love if all my queens laid eggs like this. She's hardly missed any spaces. It's all healthy looking brood. There doesn't seem to be any brood diseases going on. You see a comb like this, this hive has problems. This is the last thing you want to see. And there's a lot of reasons for why the brood can be spotty. Now you see on the top of the comb on the corners, that's honey, but I'm talking about the worker brood in the center of that comb. And there's several reasons. It could be a chalk brood or foul brood. It could even be parasitic mite syndrome. Perhaps the hive is collapsing from mites and the bees are pulling out the pupa that have mites. It could be an old failing queen. Maybe she's run out of sperm and she's no longer laying viable eggs. Or sometimes a hive that's stressed and starving will also not raise brood very well. But whenever you see a spotty or broken brood pattern like that, something is going on. And so the challenge is to figure out what that is, so then you'll know what you need to do about it. Now here's something that I never want to see, and that's, bunches of eggs laid into the comb at different angles. And what this means is the queen has died or been lost and they were not able to replace her, and that's laying workers. Now workers are infertile, so they cannot lay viable eggs that will hatch into another worker. They end up producing drones. And so a hive like this is basically doomed, and you may try to save it sort of by uniting it with a colony that has a queen in it. But if you just leave this alone by itself, eventually it's going to die, because the only baby bees that are going to be produced are drones, and the drone bees do not do any work, so eventually the hive's just going to collapse and die. So when you're performing a hive inspection, try not to have it open any longer than necessary to do an inspection. And now I know as a new beekeeper, it's going to take you much longer to do a hive inspection than someone more experienced. So that's fine. Take your time and don't squash bees and don't injure the queen. But ideally do it on a warm summer day without the wind, so it won't really bother the bees that much to be open for that long. If it's a windy and cold day, try not to have the hive open for any longer than you have to. Hold the frame so the sun is over your shoulder, shining into the cells, and that will give you a little bit better way to look in to see eggs. It helps to have reading glasses if you're older and don't have good near-sightedness. During the active season, you should see a lot of bees covering the brood area, and there should always be some stored honey and pollen. And if there isn't, their bees could be on the verge of starvation, and you may need to feed them. And then you close up the hive in reverse order, usually putting the frames in the same way that they were, although there may be times when you might move some of the empty combs inward to give the queen space to lay, but most of the time we put the frames in the same way that they were in the hive. And the other part that's important is to document what you saw. Some of us keep very detailed records. I'm a queen bee breeder, so I have to keep very detailed records, not even what type of treatments or management I did to the hive, but also, the characteristics of the hive, so I can better choose which colonies I may raise queens from. But even if you don't keep something as detailed as this, just documenting when you fed or when you checked them, or if there were eggs seen, it's a good habit to get into. To keep a notebook or some type of checklist so that you can keep track of when you treated your hives or whatnot. One of the skill sets that's very important for a new beekeeper to learn is how to use a smoker. It's so important. I have a separate presentation entirely on how to light, how to keep a smoker lit, and how to use a smoker. And so I encourage you to view that separate presentation, because using a smoker is so important. But just to go over how to use a smoker briefly as part of this introductory presentation, I will review it a little bit here. Humans have used smoke for tens of thousands of years. Long before we were beekeepers, we were honey hunters, and we learned that smoke helps control bees. It keeps them gentle. It keeps them from becoming quite as defensive. And basically what it does, it interferes with the guard bees being able to use alarm pheromone to signal to the rest of the hive. Now, some beekeepers say, well, it encourages. They think they're in a forest fire and they go up and they fill themselves up on honey. Well, maybe if you put smoke in the hive and waited 20 or 30 minutes, but I'm already in the hive in 10 to 15 seconds, and there hasn't been any time for the bee to fill up on honey and have a full belly and become docile. But what it mainly does is it just distracts from them to not signal to the other bees that the hive might be under attack. You can also use smoke to move the bees off of the top of the frame so you don't squash them, as I already mentioned. And the key is to learn how to use just enough smoke, but no more. And I think that's one of the skills that a lot of new beekeepers struggle with. You don't want to smoke them to where everybody's gagging, including yourself, but you don't want to hardly use any smoke, and then when you do need it, your smoker finally just has gone out. So before you begin, you light your smoker. There's different methods. It seems every beekeeper has their favorite method. I recommend using what you have on hand. And again, in my other presentation about how to light and use a smoker, I go into this in much detail, and I have video recording on how I do it and what I do. But basically, to summarize this briefly, you start it with easy to light materials. It's sort of like starting a campfire or a fire in your wood stove. You use paper to light the flame. As it catches, you add more solid materials such as burlap or carlab to capture the flame. You pump the bellows. You want the fire to be hot and smoldering. And it goes without saying, you need to be very careful to avoid starting a grass fire or forest fire. Many of us, including myself, live in more arid environments, and forest fires are a real danger, especially in the summer and fall. So be very careful with the flame. Be very careful when you're using your smoker not to set it on the bare ground where a spark might fly out and start a fire, after you're long gone. There's plenty of situations where beekeepers accidentally started a fire without knowing about it and, burned down not only their beehives but a lot of other things in the area. As you begin building the fire, you use the Hive tool to push down the material while not putting the fire out. And then finally you add the densest materials on top for a nice long-lasting cold smoke. I use wood pellets myself, but you can use pine cones and corn cob and other things. And then finally I try to cover with a material to prevent sparks from flying out, so green grass works really well. But again, I do have a whole separate presentation where you can watch how this is done and get a better idea. A lot of us experienced beekeepers have been around bees for so long. We really don't think that much about stings. It truly is part of beekeeping. It's not a big part of beekeeping. It's just something that happens. And I know some of the more experienced beekeepers, over time, the stings don't really bother us. They hurt, of course, but they don't really swell up or itch. But it is important to be, to be safe and try to minimize the dangers associated with stings. Part of preventing stings is just simply your behavior. Again, I worked side by side with another beekeeper, and the hive that I had opened was basically ignoring me. Meanwhile, the hive the other beekeeper had opened was kind of freaking out and going crazy and stinging them, and even sometimes coming over to me. And sometimes it's just how you hold yourself. If you're slow, no sudden movements, you don't squash bees, they're less likely to get excited. The other thing is try not to wear dark clothing or sunglasses in the bee yard. If you think about honeybees, what is their natural enemy in the wild? Bears. Bears tend to be dark and hairy, and if you're going to dissuade a bear and you're only a little tiny bee, that you have to go to the part of the bear that you can not get tangled in the hair, but go to the shiny parts, which are either the nose or the eyes. And so I might wear sunglasses when I'm driving to my outyard, but as soon as I get to my outyard, those sunglasses come off and are left in the truck simply because the bees might see that and they might come to sting the sunglass and miss the sunglass and hit you in the cheek or the forehead. And the other thing is, you don't have to try to be tough or brave. If a hive simply becomes uncontrollable or you don't feel comfortable, there's a time to just close it up and wait for a better day. There's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing to be gained by trying to be, to be brave about this. Even me, if I have a hive that seems to get out of line, or maybe I didn't, put on the right protection, I'll close it up and come back later. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, sometimes colonies can be excessively defensive. There's different reasons for this. Maybe you didn't use enough smoke. I know a lot of new beekeepers. They're like, I didn't like the smoke, or I couldn't keep it lit anyway. I didn't think I needed it. And then their bees became fairly defensive, and so that's something that you should always have a smoker lit. Even in the warm summer days during the honey flow, where I hardly have to use any smoke at all. My smoker is lit first thing in the morning when I start working my hives, and it's smoldering along, and it's staying lit until I come back home later that evening. If you're checking on times when the bees are known to be irritable, you kind of need to expect this, cold or rainy days or in the evening or night time. These are really not good times to check hives. I totally understand there might be a time you need to get in to introduce a queen or to do a mite treatment or to feed a hive and you just don't have a choice. But if you can wait till the next day or later in the afternoon where the weather changes, it's always better. The genetics of the bees also can play a role. If you're in the southern part of the United States, there's the chance for getting your bees bred with Africanized bees, and they can be very defensive. But even among all the other strains and types of bees, whether they're Italians or Carniolians, occasionally a colony of bees you've come across that just is very defensive. And the best thing to do is just requeen with another queen, because most of the genetics, most is passed on through the queen that causes colonies to be defensive like that. Sometimes when colonies are queenless, say they're in the process of swarm preparations or the queen was lost, they can be kind of grouchy. If animals disturb the hive at night, I can't tell you how many times I was working hives and came back, they're very nice, and came back the next day. I didn't even, hardly start working the hives, and they were all over me. And I look and I see there were scratch marks, and the poor bees were fighting skunks all night long. And so, they just were all worked up, and, I didn't know that, but, I can't really blame them that as soon as I started, coming around, that they were all, ready to defend themselves. Sometimes when the hives are robbing each other, they can get defensive as well. And then also when there's a dearth and there's no nectar coming in. It's pretty amazing. During the honey flow, many colonies are pretty gentle and relaxed and laid back. They're focused on bringing the nectar in. But once that's stopped, even within a day or two, their behavior and their mood can completely change. They're all sitting in the hive, and there's nothing for them to do because there's no nectar coming in. And now you open the hive, well, now there's something for them to do. Come after you. And so sometimes it's not really the bee's fault. It's just, the situation or the time of year or the time of day that you're checking them. But if you do have a hive that seems to be defensive and kind of, irritable and moody compared to all the other hives that you have, that probably is a hive that's going to need to be requeened at some point. So what do you do if you're stung? There's all kinds of myths online. You need to, squeeze the stinger out, or you need to use a suction device to suck it out. But honestly, the most effective thing to do is scrape it out as quick as possible. Because if you do that, the venom won't be able to get pumped in. If you look at a bee sting and you leave it in and you watch what happens, there's a little venom sac that continues to pump for a few seconds after the bee left that stinger in. And so you don't have to, there's not really any specific method, just scrape it out because less venom will get into the sting site. It's normal for a small welt or swelling to form around the sting, especially if you're a new beekeeper who has not been stung a lot. Usually the pain will go away within a few minutes or a half hour. Over time, many experienced beekeepers eventually become kind of immune to the swelling or itching part, although the stings still certainly hurt depending on where they happen to have stung you. So it's completely normal to have local swelling, and if it's bothering you or you have itchiness, you can use diphenhydramine, over-the-counter antihistamine, put ice over the sting. With time and more stings, many beekeepers experience less swelling, but sometimes some beekeepers actually it goes the other way, and they can actually have worsening sting reactions over time. And that's a problem because that might be a sign and an indication that you could be one of those people that are unlucky enough to begin developing more severe systemic sting reactions or even anaphylaxis. So if you experience any reaction away from the sting site itself, such as hives, I'm not talking about your beehives obviously, but actually the hives on your skin, swelling far away from the location of the stings, wheezing, trouble breathing, asthma, you need to seek medical attention immediately. This is nothing to be ignored, because it could be a sign that you're in the process of getting more severe reactions or even anaphylaxis. Now, anaphylaxis from bee stings fortunately is uncommon, but it potentially is life-threatening. Every year there are stories of beekeepers or family members of beekeepers who experience anaphylaxis, and sadly, tragically, they don't survive. It's interestingly more common among family members of beekeepers than the general public. If a family member is exposed to the bee dust, let's say they're doing laundry, or maybe they get stung, every several years, there's enough of the venom exposure to cause them to develop a reaction, but not to develop immunity, as compared to the general public that maybe doesn't get stung at all. Now, beekeepers who don't get stung a lot, less than about 10 stings per year, are also more likely to develop anaphylaxis as compared to somebody who's getting stung, at least once or twice a month. And there's even published, research regarding this. So myself, I'm not really, I consider stings being part of, my life as a beekeeper. And luckily, it's been so many decades that I really don't react. Obviously, if they sting me on my fingernail or my nose, I'm going to react because it still hurts. I just don't swell up. But if you do begin developing what you are worried about could be an indication of anaphylaxis or severe sting reactions, this is nothing to be trifled with, and this is certainly nothing to post on social media asking what you should do, or even other beekeepers. You really need to consult with a healthcare practitioner, and if necessary, get referred to a board-certified, fellowship-trained allergy and immunology doctor. Well, this concludes our presentation on hive inspections, how to use a smoker, safety, and how to minimize stings. It's only intended to be an overview and not a deep, in-depth review of all of these things. And again, I encourage you to go to my separate presentation showing you how I actually light my smoker and use it. To summarize, inspect your hives regularly, but not too much. Learn how to read the brood and the behavior of the hive, and this only comes from experience. You can read books, you can watch videos like this, but you're just not going to learn as much as just keeping bees and being out there and being in the bee yard looking at your hives. Keep records, even basic ones, like the date that you fed them or you did a mite treatment so you'll remember. If you have a question about maybe a queen needing to be replaced, make a note of that. Try to check your hives on sunny, warm days without much wind if possible. Learn how to light your smoker and keep it lit. Even on days when you don't really need it, it's always good to have it there as backup because invariably you'll have a hive that starts acting up and you need the smoker right now, not 15 minutes from now. So really learn and practice how to use your smoker. And then be careful, of course, so you don't start a grass fire or a forest fire. Don't be afraid of stings, but on the other hand, don't be overly brave and confident either. It's perfectly natural to not want to get stung. Take precautions to minimize stings. If fear of stinging is keeping you from checking your bees and working with your bees, just glove up and put on your jacket and you're good to go. However, though, if you start experiencing reactions that you think are more serious than you should be having, seek professional medical advice. There are many beekeepers who develop severe reactions or even anaphylaxis who respond quite well to sting desensitization by allergy immunology doctors. But again, this really needs to be recommended and performed and monitored by a trained medical professional. Well, thank you for watching this video in our series Introduction to Beekeeping. I hope this information is helpful so that you can become the most confident and successful beekeeper possible. Have a great day.